Good afternoon and good evening to all of you, wherever you're joining us from. I am Magda Tedder, and I'm the Schiller Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham, and it is my honor to welcome you to today's event. When we planned this event last year, we did not anticipate that it would have such contemporary resonance, and we did not think that it would turn into one of several events Fordham Center for Jewish Studies would organize about Ukraine. The event was to explore questions of memory and forgetting and engage the three scholars whose books are in conversation with each other. 20th century is marked by mass violence, with the Shoah and World War II dominating historical memory. But decades before the Shoah, other mass violence took place, with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews massacred in Eastern Europe. The violence of the early 20th century. Scholars and readers of Jewish history know and remember the pogroms of 1881, the Kishinev pogrom, the pogroms of 1905, but the violence that followed the Great War, or as we now call it, World War I, has largely been forgotten. Three recent books have recovered this traumatic past. Elissa Bemporad's Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Land of the Soviets, which came out in 2019. Jaclyn Granick's International Jewish Humanitarianism in the Age of Great War, which came out last year. And also last year, Jefferey Veidlinger's In the Midst of Civilized Europe, Pogroms of 1918, 1921, and the Onset of the Holocaust. Today, they will explore the forgotten violence, its history and legacy, and reflect on its new meaning given the current war in Ukraine. So let me introduce the speakers. Elissa Bemporad holds the Ungar Chair of East European Jewish History and the Holocaust and is Professor of History at Queen's College and the CUNY Graduate Center. She is a two-time winner of the National Jewish Book Award, and she is the author of Becoming Soviet Jews, the Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, and The Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of the Soviets. Elissa is the co-editor of two volumes, Women and Genocide, Survivors, Victims, and Perpetrators, and most recently, which also came out last year, Pogroms, A Documentary History. Jaclyn Granick is a senior lecturer, which in American terms is the equivalent of associate professor in modern Jewish history at Cardiff University in Wales in the UK. She is the author of the mentioned already International Jewish Humanitarianism and the Age of Great War, which came out last year from Cambridge, and is co-editor of a special issue, Gendering Jewish Internationalism, Inter/Nationalism, in the Journal of Modern Jewish Studies. She's currently serving as a co-investigator of the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council funded Humanities Council funded Jewish Country Houses Research Project. And our third speaker is Jefferey Veidlinger, who is the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. He's the author of many books, including the most recent one, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, the Pogroms of 1918, 1921, and the Onset of the Holocaust, and the award-winning books like the Moscow State Yiddish Theater, Jewish Culture and on the Soviet Stage, which came out in 2000, Jewish Public Culture in the Late Russian Empire in 2009, and In the Shadow of the Shtetl, Small-Town Jewish Life in Soviet Ukraine, which came out in 2013. He is the editor of Going to the People, Jews and Ethnographic Impulses, which came out in 2016. Professor Veidlinger is the chair of the Academic Advisory Council of the Center for Jewish History, a member of Executive Committee of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and a former vice president of the Association for Jewish Studies. Before I hand over the screen to our distinguished panelists, I want to express my thanks to all of you for joining us and for your generosity and support. All events are possible through the generosity of the Knapp Family Foundation, the Pickett Family Foundation, and so many individual donations from so many of you joining us. We're grateful. Without you, we would not be here. So now let's get us started. Elissa and Jaclyn and Jeff, all three of your books excavate the dark and, as you all note, forgotten past, and they shine light on its importance. Elissa, your compelling book, Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of the Soviet, looks at the memory and the lasting legacy of this violence in the Soviet Union. Jaclyn, your detailed and really meticulously researched book, International Jewish Humanitarianism in the Age of Great War, examines the rise of non-governmental coordination, humanitarian mobilization, and the ascendancy of both the United States and its Jewish community in response to the violence of World War I and the aftermath. And Jeff, your book is much more focused on the pogroms themselves, and offers a narrative of the years of violence that followed the end of World War I in Eastern Europe, arguing that this violence prepared the ground for the murder of Jews a generation later during the Second World War. Probably most of our listeners have not read all of your three books, though I'm sure many have read at least some. So I wonder whether you could tell us more about your projects and the questions you asked and the answers you found or perhaps did not. And we can just start with Elissa, who has, she's
here I am.
Yes, and then I guess we'll go in the order of the books mentioned. So,
thank you so much, Magda, for organizing and for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. So, I just want to start by saying that my book tells the story of what happened to the two most extreme manifestations of Tsarist anti-Semitism, namely pogroms and blood libels, in the context of the Soviet Union. So from 1917 until the early 1960s. And I decided to bring together ritual murder, blood libel, and pogroms, not only because these events were and are considered so central to the modern Jewish experience in Eastern Europe, but also because they were often closely intertwined in Jewish history and memory, right? The accusation of blood libel very often triggered anti-Jewish violence. So in this book really tries to investigate what happened to the pogroms and to the blood libels after 1917, two themes that were largely absent, I would say, in the historiography, or not well integrated into the history and into the study of the experience of Jews who lived in the context of the Soviet territories. So what I do, I really trace the afterlife of these manifestations of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence. And by doing that, I shed light on, I guess, the broad question of the changing position of Jews in Soviet society, the relationship between Jews and the state, and Jews and their neighbors. And again, I do this by using violence as a lens. So let me just dwell a little bit on the question of anti-Jewish violence and the pogrom theme, and the way in which I address it in my book. The book, I guess I have three chapters that really focus on on the pogroms of the Russian Civil War. And the book begins with a social history of this unprecedented wave of anti-Jewish violence, hundreds of pogroms that took place in different towns, cities, villages throughout Ukraine, Belarus, southern Russia, approximately 1,500 pogroms, as many as 100,000 or more Jews who were murdered during the violence or as a result of the violence. And what surprised me the most as I was, as I was writing this book is how extreme the anti-Jewish violence was in the context of the Civil War from the end of 1917 until 1921, compared to previous waves of pogroms, compared to previous waves of anti-Jewish violence. In many instances, the violence turns genocidal. Some victims compare it to the Armenian genocide, although the term genocide did not exist yet. Murder, rape, looting become socially acceptable and are carried out by all troops involved in these pogroms, also, which have been also defined as military pogroms, but they're also being carried out by neighbors. So that was really, that surprised me, which kind of connects to what you just said, Magda, about the fact that this is largely forgotten. And the other thing that surprised me was how little choice, the little choices that the members of the Jewish communities had as they are caught up in the midst of this violence. And caught up in the crossfire of new allegiances that are at stake during the Civil War. Just one last, point. The main goal that I had, at least in 2 chapters, it was really to explore the legacy of this violence for the large majority of Jews who stayed in those territories that were affected by the violence, because many fled, thousands fled, but the overwhelming majority stayed in those territories that then became the Soviet Union. So how do we integrate this experience in the study of Soviet Jews? How does this experience, how does this trauma affect the process of acculturation, assimilation of Jews in the Soviet Union? And how is Jewish identity affected by this violence? And so I really tried to capture the long-term impact, the short-term and the long-term impact of this trauma of the violence of the Civil War, a trauma that had a lasting imprint on the way in which Jews related to the Bolshevik state, related to their neighbors, the way in which they came to choose, in a way, the lesser of two evils, siding with the Red Army, which during the pogroms, killed less Jews, or at a certain point stopped killing Jews altogether. And again, this experience remains a founding one for Soviet Jewry, especially against the backdrop of a new society, Soviet society, that saw the virtual disappearance of pogroms. So it affects, again, the relationship with the state, the relationship with the neighbors, and also it has an impact on Jewish identity. And I think I'll stop here, Magda.
Yeah, so Jaclyn, you come out from the outside, and then we'll go with Jeff, who goes from deeply inside onto the ground in his book. So
exactly. So I think of myself as an international political historian and a modern Jewish historian. And therefore, the questions I asked as I started this project began with thinking about Jewish international political activism. And I saw that the First World War was a major transition point for international political order. And I felt like it might be a more interesting angle to think about Jews because I was feeling like the Holocaust was such an exceptional part of the Second World War that I should look at an earlier war. So as I started to try to figure out an angle, I began looking at the peace treaty in 1919 and the minorities treaties, which were part of the peace. And then I started looking in the League of Nations archives in the 1920s, and ultimately decided that the real story lay not with these kinds of formal political congresses and bodies, but in the international humanitarian associations that had proliferated in the First World War and were really a barely explored realm of soft diplomacy in that era. And that was a realm in which Jews were able to work because its boundaries were so porous and so new. My book is about how international humanitarianism, relief work, and international development work came into existence as a fundamental part of war in the First World War. And Jews were crucial in establishing its non-state civilian components and in harnessing the Jewish diaspora in order to do this humanitarian relief. I wanted to figure out what all these humanitarian organizations, American, European, Jewish, and non-Jewish, how and why they operated, and what place Jews had among them. Especially this one organization that seemed to pop up everywhere, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And I was sort of thinking as I went into this, what was the Joint accomplishing under the radar as, for example, Jewish petitions to the League of Nations regarding the violence in Ukraine were buried in civil service paperwork. I concluded that the Joint, as a sort of glue in a mosaic of Jewish philanthropic and humanitarian associations that were working to restore Jewish life, provide relief, the Joint had actually invented something that looked like a social welfare state in diaspora. It was designed to restore Jews and Jewish communities and to help them develop futures in a variety of new post-war situations. And this mosaic was complex, it was global in scope, and while it built on pre-war initiatives, ideologies, and institutions, it was totally unique to the interwar period, especially its first decade, the 1920s, when the horrors of the First World War were fresh, but there was still hope that the violence had receded. So I'll stop there for now.
And of course, there wouldn't be all that intervention without that violence. And Jeff, if you could now talk about your really, detailed study of each, well, not all of them, obviously, but many of those key pogroms of the aftermath of the war.
Yeah, so thanks, Magda, and thank you both Jaclyn and Elissa for your comments. I agree entirely with what they're saying, and in fact, what I can just add on the margins to what they have talked about. But I became interested in the pogroms of 1918 to 1921 when I was conducting an oral history project in Ukraine between about 2000 and 2010. And I would travel with my colleague Dovber Kurler, interviewing elderly Yiddish speakers about their lives and how they survived the Holocaust and how they survived communism. And I was struck at the time by how many of them spoke about the pogroms of this period and how they spoke about it in similar terms to which they spoke about the Holocaust. And it made me interested in investigating these pogroms in greater detail. I certainly knew of pogroms, as everybody does, I think. But I also, when I thought of pogroms, I thought of the 1881 pogroms, in which about a dozen people were killed. They were absolutely terrible bouts of violence, but resulted in the deaths of about a dozen people. Then 1903 to 1906 pogroms, and particularly Kishinev. Kishinev resulted in the deaths of about 50 people. And in that entire 3-year period, a spate of pogroms of somewhere between 400 to 700 separate incidents resulted in the deaths of about 3,000 to 5,000 people. And then 1918 to 1921 resulted in the deaths of, as Elissa said, about 40,000 to 100,000 people are the figures that I use. So much larger bout of violence. And when we were interviewing people in 2007, they would break down in tears talking about these pogroms that had taken place 90 years earlier. And that got me thinking about the impact that these pogroms must have had 20 years after. If 90 years after, they're still shattering in the legacy of the...
Oops. We froze. Jeff is frozen.
Mass killings of the Holocaust took place in these very same towns in which these pogroms happened 20 years earlier. So I was interested in how it set the stage for the violence to come. And one thing that made me recognize even more that there's a connection here, or that there's at least similarities, is first the recognition that the pogroms of 1918 to 1921 were not only local toughs with pitchforks coming into town and attacking Jewish stores. They were that, and many of them were that, but there were also military actions. They were also trained soldiers going in town to town and systematically rounding up Jews, sometimes taking them to the outskirts of town and massacring them, at other times rounding up Jews, at least one occasion, forcing them into a barn and burning the barn to the ground. This is the type of crime that we associate more with the Holocaust. And at the same time that I was coming to this realization, maybe even a little bit before, others were pointing out that the Holocaust in the East was also characterized not only by the systematic mass killings that we associate with Auschwitz or the other death camps, but was also close action of neighbors against neighbors. It was also locals with pitchforks going into town rounding up Jews. So really these two events, at least in the first months of the Holocaust in the summer of 1941, have a lot of similarities to what took place in 1918 to 1921. And we can trace more direct connections between them, which I do in the book and won't really talk about right this second, but we can trace more direct connections between them. And so I was interested in just going in and looking at the violence. And we can see that every side in this massive conflict that's often called the Russian Civil War, but that's really a misnomer because it was all types of different entities fighting each other. But one thing that every side had in common was an animosity towards the Jews. And at the same time, the Jewish community, which was scattered throughout this territory as the vast empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, and the Russian Empire broke apart, the Jews were scattered in urban enclaves throughout that entire territory. They weren't concentrated in any one area that allowed them a claim of sovereignty. As a result, Jews could be found on all sides of the conflict, which meant that every side in the conflict could blame the Jews. So the Bolsheviks blamed the Jews for being capitalists, for being the merchants and the store owners. And the merchants and store owners and elites blamed the Jews for being Bolsheviks. The Poles accused the Jews of being loyal to the Ukrainians accused them of being loyal to the Poles. The Russians accused them of being loyal to the Germans during the war, and the Germans accused them of being loyal to the Russians. Every side was attacking the Jews for their own purposes until, at a certain point in time, the Bolsheviks start clamping down on violence against Jews. And this leads to a gravitation of Jews towards the side of the Bolsheviks. And more Jews side with the Red Army, because the Red Army alone comes into town and they kick out the local bandits who are committing atrocities against the Jews. And they alone round up the Jews in the center of town, But instead of marching the Jews to the outskirts of town to kill them, the Bolsheviks say to the Jews, "We have liberated you, and now join us and help us liberate your brethren in the next city over." And sure enough, many Jews do join the Red Army and then move to the next city over. And that leads to a snowball effect where, as more and more Jews gravitate towards the Red Army, the popular perception, popular equation between Jews and the Red Army increases. And the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism becomes more prominent in the area. At the same time, the Bolsheviks during this conflict are promising land, bread, and peace. And those are pretty good things. And so the old elites, in order to get the peasants on their side, say the Bolsheviks aren't really going to give you land, bread, and peace, but really this is just a ploy by the Jews to distract you. And they realize that the old elites, whether it's the Russian Imperial Army or the Ukrainian nationalists, they realize that they can turn the peasants away from the Bolsheviks, away from land, bread, and peace by claiming that the whole thing is a Jewish ploy, by playing upon old anti-Jewish stereotypes. And so this leads to this vast, I don't want to call it a conflict, but to a vast massacre, a series of atrocities that are committed against the Jews, and which all plays a role in setting the stage for that next round of violence 20 years later.
I was struck by your three books from these sort of different perspectives of how much we now are still heirs to that violence of this era from different perspectives, either the sort of broader structural perspective that Jaclyn is talking about, or that the Judeo-Bolshevism that both you and you, Jeff, and you, Elissa, are talking about. So all of you are coming from this very different vantage point, and you see this period, not just World War I and World War I. We just went through this whole commemoration of World War I, and yet I don't remember much of the discussion of the events that you have focused on in your books. In this sort of World War I ends in 1918 and end of story. And I think many kind of thinking and popular understanding of the interwar period does not remember this. I mean, I'm coming from Polish Jewish history, and that certainly is not a prominent part of the story. It's much more the vibrancy of Jewish culture and then anti-Semitism and all that, but that violence is forgotten. And yet all of you are coming from these different vantage points, whether the long view of Elissa's, or Jaclyn, you from the outside, global, and Jeff, you from the on the ground, this sort of very detailed study. And you all find these events transformative in ways, in many ways. So I wonder whether each one of you can speak to an aspect or more of how this violence, how you found it, in what aspect you found most transformative about this period, and what was different. I mean, some of you have already said what was different about this violence and its lasting impact. So I don't know who wants to take it first.
I'm happy to talk for a minute. Do you want to go in reverse order?
Yeah, let's do Jaclyn and then Elissa, and then we'll come back to you, and then yeah.
Okay, great. So my book is organized by different aid types. So that's to say a chapter on war relief, emergency food provision, chapter on refugee relief, child welfare, public health, and economic development. And the way I come to think of this violence is that it's violence that created these kinds of relief needs. And so as I kind of constructed my book at the beginning of each chapter, I often kind of set up the violence that was there that caused the crisis so overwhelmingly that Jewish humanitarian organizations had to form whole departments around the resulting violence, which meant means that I don't really look at this violence in terms of specific places or events so much as by theme. And I think that for me, the violence that created refugees seems probably the most transformational. So there are also differing counts on this, but there were over 1 million Jewish refugees related to the First World War. And David Engel has noted that the Great War marked the most extensive, most rapid geopolitical displacement in Jewish history since late antiquity. And I think this is really shocking to most people to hear this information about the First World War, rather than hearing it about the Holocaust. And it was about multiple forms of violence cohering, forcing people to flee their homes en masse, and risking their lives to try to swim across the border between Ukraine and Romania, for example. But it was also about a more mundane kind of violence undertaken in the West, which responded by raising its border controls and forced its own Jewish populations to make choices between helping their kin abroad and retaining their own security at home. So it was especially shocking to me as I read all of these documents to try to internalize that the refugee crisis we had all seemed to agree began with Nazi decrees in the 1930s in Central Europe was actually more like the kind of direct ethnic violence that had characterized Ukraine that had been occurring since the First World War, bleeding westward, while states further to the west remained unchanged in their closed response towards refugees. Great War Jewish refugees evolved into a permanently, fundamentally precarious group whose mere debased presence aroused anti-Semitic feeling and who could later be easily funneled into the machinery of the Holocaust. And this persistence of the Jewish refugee crisis from one war to the next shows a clear and violent link between the Jewish experience of both of those wars.
Elissa, yeah.
I jump in?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jaclyn, for your comments. Actually, some of my comments are connected to what you said. I would say that one of the aspects of this violence that really helped me reframe my understanding of anti-Jewish violence during this period is the role of rape. The role of rape against Jewish women and girls in the context of pogroms, and how central rape becomes to the pogrom script compared to previous waves of anti-Jewish violence. And, you know, thinking about the motivation of rape and the short-term and long-term consequences of sexual violence, in terms of motivation, you know, whether it was deliberately employed against Jewish women and girls as a strategic instrument of ethnic cleansing, whether it was a result of, you know, settling previous unresolved accounts between neighbors, or if it was a way to confront this alleged political enemy, the Judeo-Bolshevik, or a class enemy. Regardless of the motivation, really the physical and psychological trauma associated with rape is one of the key factors that that kind of triggers a revolution in the Jewish demographic landscape during and following the pogroms of the Civil War. So that we have, for example, accounts about how birth rate statistics for Jewish women are so different compared to what we have for women of other ethnic groups. Jewish women's birth rate dropped significantly as a result of the physical and psychological trauma associated with the systematic sexual violence. Sexual violence against Jewish women during these pogroms also serves as this powerful thrust for thousands to leave the towns and cities that were affected by by the violence and resettle elsewhere, not only to, as Jaclyn said, mention Romania, but also to, within the context of the new Soviet system, moving to Moscow, moving to Leningrad, to Kiev. So we have many accounts of doctors who are treating rape victims who write about the fact that so many rape victims are trying desperately to leave the cities of death, right? Driven by the horrific memories of rape. But then you also have, the question of how mass rape is connected to modernization and urbanization. I'd never thought about the fact that mass rape could serve as a force to modernize and urbanize Jews, right? And indirectly even increase the pace of acculturation and Sovietization, so that rape, or the fear of rape of daughters, sisters, and wives, becomes this decisive factor in encouraging many to leave, to resettle elsewhere, to larger urban centers, as a preemptive measure in the hope that violence would not occur again. And finally, also what is so, again, I had not thought of this before I wrote this book, is that responding to trauma, to sexual violence, is also, it's not only about remembering, but very often it's about forgetting, right? Oblivion. So that for many, the only conceivable response to the trauma experience during the pogroms is really this kind of emotional resettlement made of oblivion. So suppressing the memory of sexual violence could be attained, could be achieved only by resettling elsewhere, by engaging in a kind of successful horizontal socialization in this kind of, even through assimilation and intermarriage, right? Elsewhere in larger urban centers. So this, for me, was a crucial aspect of my research. I have another crucial aspect, but I'll stop here.
So I'll say, in addition to, again, agreeing with what Jaclyn and Elissa said, and I may add to that in a minute, you mentioned that we have mostly forgotten these pogroms until recently. And it's interesting that we have. The reason we have is obviously because of the Holocaust and the sheer enormity of the Holocaust. But I want to point out that in the interwar period, they were talked about very extensively. And in fact, when I started to look for what people were saying about the pogroms in the interwar period and whether people were talking about it, I was shocked not only at that people were talking about it, but the extent to which people were talking about it, that in some ways it seems it's all anybody was talking about. And I was struck, I have at the very beginning of my book, I talk about this. I was struck by a headline in the New York Times that said 127,000 Jews killed in Ukraine, 6 million more in peril. And the article ends with the sentence, unless drastic action is taken immediately, 6 million Jews in Ukraine and in Poland are slated for physical extermination, or something along those lines. And it's not just the New York Times. There were many papers and many individuals predicting that this was only the first wave of violence, and that very soon there was going to be another wave of violence that would lead to the physical extermination of the entirety of the Jewish population in Poland and Ukraine. And it's disturbing to see how everybody was talking about that and the extent to which they were before it happened. And what's even more disturbing is they didn't sit on their hands and do nothing about it. They were doing a lot about it. In order to respond to this, the world Jewish leadership petitioned the great powers in Paris to ensure that minority rights are put into the constitutions of Poland and Romania. They advocated for the establishment of a Jewish refuge in Palestine. They migrated by the hundreds of thousands and got out of there. They established, vast self-help organizations like the Joint and built upon the Joint. They took all of the action that they knew how to take in order to prevent what they saw as the coming destruction of European Jewry. And the tragedy is that it just wasn't enough, that they did everything and that still wasn't enough. I want to say another word about the other big impact of it, and that is, as Jaclyn mentioned, migration. Hundreds of thousands, we don't know the exact number, I say about 300,000 to 500,000 Jews left the Soviet sphere. About 70% of the Jewish population in 1926, first of all, reported in the Jewish population in the Soviet Union, reported they weren't living in the place they were born. So there was a tremendous amount of internal migration as well, of people leaving small towns for larger cities or fleeing Ukraine from Moscow and St. Petersburg. But in particular, I want to say something about the massive wave of refugees that fled into predominantly Germany between 1919 and 1923. And I think that we as historians have underestimated the role that that wave of refugees played in the rise of the Nazi Party. And you see it in 1919, in the very early days of far-right movements in Germany. They're railing against these Eastern European Jews, who they claim are utilizing all of the social services. They're bringing disease, they're bringing the flu, they're bringing, and most saliently, they're importing Bolshevism. And even though they're fleeing Bolshevism, right? These are the Jews who are fleeing Bolshevism, but they are still accused, these refugees, of importing Bolshevism into our countries. And country after country after country starts to put in immigration restrictions in 1923, specifically to prevent these Jewish refugees from importing Bolshevism. And we see it, in early Nazi propaganda against the Ostjuden, and particularly in the propaganda, of Alfred Rosenberg, who himself is a Balt, who was in this region, brought the idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, introduced the accusation of Judeo-Bolshevism into Germany. So I think that fear of refugees and the refugee crisis, we've really underestimated, and it should be looked at in greater detail. I'm glad that Jaclyn's mentioned it. I think I'll leave it at that.
No, that was really something for me too when I was reading your books. That I mean, with Elissa's the sort of urbanization of the move of Soviet Jews into these, several of these massive urban centers. I mean, we've always known Jews were an urban element, but we were thinking of small towns as urban element. But here they sort of moved to this, and then both Jaclyn's and Jeff's, your book of the move to the West, and found like, wow, this is what it's all about. This is why this language about disease and the imagery that is produced of the thing is coming out. And there is this context that somehow is forgotten, but yet, as you said, it was not forgotten at the time. And it seems that it was sort of forgotten or repressed in the West. But Jeff, when you were pointing out your interviews, clearly that memory persisted in Ukraine itself among the Jewish community that continued there. So there's I wonder, I know it seems to me a kind of a too neat an explanation to explain that the massive violence of the Shoah is the reason why we forgot about it. Can there be other reasons? I'm sure obviously the Holocaust and the Shoah played a role, but can there be other reasons why this important part of history has kind of been, forgotten? So I don't know who wants to take that. I don't want to point fingers.
I mean, I'll say, since, I'll defend that, the timing is pretty clear, because again, it seems that it's all anybody's talking about until 1941 or so. Then from 1946 on, nobody's talking about it until, Cherry Cover publishes his Yiddish language, or posthumously Cherry Cover's Yiddish language book on the pogroms is published in 1965, but there's no follow-up on it. I do think that that's the main reason. There's other possible reasons. I don't think these are the reasons, but there's also another wave of violence that takes place after the pogroms, and that's the wave of violence of the massacre of perpetrators of pogroms. So that also brings, some discomfort, I think.
I want to talk a little bit about the way it relates to First World War memory generally. So, because I think of myself as, in part, a First World War historian, and I went to several of those kind of commemorative 100 years after First World War kinds of conferences and projects that Magda mentioned, and I was and am often one of the few Jewish historians who show up at that kind of thing, and there's kind of an emerging discourse in First World War studies trying to get English language scholars to look at the Eastern Front rather than the Western Front, and what is so obvious to Russian or Soviet historians or East Central European historians is not at all obvious to people in the places where most of us are on this call are living. And I think one thing that is sort of, First World War historians make the point that a lot of these kinds of memories related to the First World War didn't persist because of the way that the map and state power was reshaped. So the legacies of imperial collapse didn't necessarily have a route to go in all of the new states, successor states that formed in these regions. Very few of the states really wanted to emphasize the way in which their new states were forged in this kind of violence. And so, or to kind of discuss the kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic stakes. So as they tried to kind of consolidate their new states. So I think that there's also this way in which First World War history, especially First World War history of the Eastern Front, kind of gets pulled apart into different national narratives where it's really difficult to find space for the kind of memories of this traumatic violence. And that includes the violence against Jews.
Elissa.
Yeah, so I agree. I definitely agree with Jeff about about the obvious statement, with regard to the fact that the Holocaust overshadowed what happened in the very same territories, the same towns and cities some 20 years later. I had also thought a lot, and I think that Jaclyn, you discussed this in your book, about the international context, right? The fact that when we do have Jewish delegations at the Paris Peace Conference that try to draw attention to the faith of Ukrainian Jews and to the violence that is taking place in Ukraine as the epicenter, the West, meaning the US, England, and France, really respond by refocusing their attention and concern mostly on the new allies in Eastern Europe, right? Poland, to some degree, Romania, and the sense of urgency in the context of Ukraine is no longer on the table, or is overshadowed by other priorities in the context of the political debates. So it's a history that is kind of, I say, a memory and a history that is kind of obfuscated in favor of developments in Poland and minority treaties and negotiations. But the other point that I would like to make, I think that the Soviet politics of memory does play a key role in overshadowing the history of the pogroms of the Civil War, meaning that the pogroms, by their very nature, represented a problem for the Bolsheviks. They could not be read through the lens of Marxism and communism because you know, you have different social classes that are perpetrating the violence. It's not only the bourgeoisie that is killing the working class, right? So the pogromчики target Jews from all classes, so that what you see is that you have, especially in the 1930s, a universalization of the victim. It's no longer Jews who are targeted for violence during the pogroms, but it's, you know, the working class. It's those who supported, you know, the revolution. So the memory of these pogroms is in a way downplayed in favor of the pogroms that are much less problematic, right? The pre-revolutionary pogroms, Kishinev, or the pogroms in 1905, 1906, when you can really pinpoint, you know, Tsarist Russia and the bourgeoisie as the enemies. And we see this ambivalence on the part of the Soviets in the trials against pogromчики that we have in the early 1920s, those who are you know, identified as guilty are usually not identified as guilty of killing Jews, but are identified as guilty of being counter-revolutionaries. And language does matter. So I think that that we, you know, in explaining why this memory is, you know, why these pogroms are kind of forgotten, we also have to take into consideration the Soviet politics of memory of this violence.
Yeah, and some of these patterns, you know, are established at that point. The universalization of violence as not, and sort of forgetting that Jews were the targets of violence, right? It was in the Soviet, certainly in the Soviet Union, that later on would be replicated in the aftermath of World War II, where the sort of it was the crimes against humanities against the citizens of these various countries, rather than specifying that these were crimes against Jews, and Jews were targets of that violence. So certainly some of the patterns emerge in that way. All of your books are also, and your responses to touch on on obviously anti-Semitism, but also the variety of anti-Semitic tropes that still persist, right? I mean, in somebody comments in the Q&A section how the Judeo-communism is still such a powerful trope that still, you know, is used, certainly in Poland. It's very much used, and I would argue is preventing the kind of true reckoning and not reconciliation, but dealing with the past. So you are all touch upon in your work these very, at least two, if not more, anti-Semitic tropes, whether it's Judeo-Bolshevism or the, you know, we were discussing the interventions in the Paris peace conference, securing the minority rights, and that certainly was used in interwar Poland as the sort of pushed down the throats of Polish delegation by Jews, and so the sort of global political involvement of Jews is one of the anti-Semitic tropes. Judeo-communism or Judeo-Bolshevism is another. How did each one of you manage to avoid being apologetic, to avoid, you know, to negotiate that boundary between dealing with these anti-Semitic tropes and the historical context that is tied to these two examples of persistent anti-Semitic ideas? And each one of you have done a great job by not, you know, trying to explain something away and dismiss something, but actually dealing with the substance of the historical substance and the tropes. So again, I don't know who wants to jump in.
I can say, I mean, in my book, I try to avoid use of the word anti-Semitism because I think it's a deeply problematic word to use in this context. And I'm trying to explain violence, both violence of the Holocaust and violence of these pogroms, not explain it away, but explain it. And it's rooted in a variety of things relating to socioeconomic competition, the fall of empires, the conflicts between town and country, and anti-Semitism or tropes of anti-Semitism are utilized in order to direct anger against the Jews. But I don't think people are just seething with, I don't think even those who perpetrate atrocities against Jews are necessarily seething with anti-Semitism their entire lives, just waiting for the opportunity to get their hands on some Jews and kill them. But it's specific circumstances that allow that, that allow those sentiments, or that allow them to channel their frustrations, their hunger, their hatred against the Jews. To give a specific example, if we think of situations in which Jewish stores are looted, which is often the very beginning of a pogrom. These are taking place in 1919. So the peasantry have already been starving through war for 4 or 5 years. They haven't been able to till the land. Their crops have suffered as a result of armies going over their farms. Their parents, it is often teenagers who are committing these atrocities. Their parents have been out fighting instead of tilling the land. And they themselves are hungry. And it just so happens that in Ukraine, Jews tend to live in the towns, and their occupations tend to be store owners. They're grocers. They have the canteens. Their restaurants are owned by Jews. The mills are often owned by Jews. So when hungry peasants come into the city looking for food, looking for alcohol, looking for leather, they're attacking Jewish shops, because those shops are owned by the Jews. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it because of anti-Semitism. They're doing it because that's where the alcohol is, that's where the food is, and that's where the leather is. So to the Jews, this can be viewed as a pogrom and as an anti-Semitic pogrom. To the perpetrators, they can view it as requisitions, or they can view it as taking what is theirs, what the town owns, the countryside. It doesn't explain or it doesn't justify the violence, but it kind of explains it. And the same thing with the Judeo-Bolshevism. The Bolsheviks were committing atrocities, and there were visible Jews among the Bolsheviks. You can understand to a peasant, the leader of the Bolsheviks was, of course, Vladimir Lenin, but he's there in Petrograd. And the face of the Bolsheviks, both in Ukraine and to the Western world, was Trotsky. He was the Commissar of Foreign Affairs, and he was the head of the Red Army. He was the most prominent spokesperson of the Bolsheviks to the Western world. And he was also well known as having a Jewish background, although, he denied it. He wasn't acting in the name of Jews, and, he had nothing to do with Judaism, but he was known to have a Jewish background. And that, the combination of the real atrocities that the Bolsheviks were committing, along with everybody else who was also committing atrocities, but the real atrocities that the Bolsheviks were committing, and the visibility of a few Jews within their leadership, as well as I mentioned, the wave of Jews joining the Red Army, particularly in Ukraine, in order to combat pogroms, explains some of the animosity that ordinary folk were feeling towards Jews. Doesn't justify it, but it explains it.
Jaclyn, you want to go and then I'll go, or?
Sure. So, as I was researching and writing this book, I really started to panic at dealing with the weight and baggage of anti-Semitism in my story and how it might resonate in the present. Anti-Semitism is a part of my book in so many ways. But my book is mainly exploring the way in which Jewish humanitarianism differs from other kinds of humanitarianism due to the baggage of anti-Semitism. The book is mainly about anti-Semitism in that way. no other humanitarian organizations were worried about responding to violence caused by anti-Semitism while also facing anti-Semitic overt and hidden discrimination themselves, while also weighing all their decisions as they thought through which courses of action might be least likely to inflame anti-Semitism or might reduce anti-Semitism. So I sort of came to this realization that although these organizations rarely discussed anti-Semitism in their own daily lives, their worries about anti-Semitism really animated so many of their actions and decisions. On the other hand, it was never difficult for me to negotiate historical fact and anti-Semitic tropes. If I started to kind of panic that, oh, there is kind of this global political involvement of Jews, I could quickly, instantly show that there was no kind of conspiracy behind it. It was trying to respond in the ways that they could to horrific violence. I had overwhelming evidence, and it would have been impossible to have made up the staggering humanitarian response in its reams and reams and reams of technocratic detail. But what was harder was trying to figure out how to notice how anti-Semitism shaped the way in which Jewish humanitarianism worked, to see the ways in which Jewish humanitarian was distorted as it took on its own, or it was projected by others into these new anti-Semitic tropes, say in The Doctor's Plot that Elissa writes about. And to just, rather than, I didn't avoid the word anti-Semitism, I didn't use the word very much, but to sometimes be brave enough to say anti-Semitism when it was there is what was actually very hard for me.
Okay. For me, I'm very much in favor of using the term anti-Semitism. And I think that when we study anti-Semitism, but also when we study racism, Islamophobia, we have to be very careful in disentangling, myths from historical facts. And I think we can do that successfully by rooting a manifestation of racism or anti-Semitism, rooting it deeply in the context that we are studying. And, for me, in the context, especially in the Soviet context, I think it's very important to use the term anti-Semitism, which is being weaponized by the state, by Jews, by their neighbors. So it is important to use it. Of course, again, you have to explain what that means, and you have to contextualize it deeply. To address specifically the question of Judeo-Bolshevism that you asked, Magda, I think there are many pieces to the puzzle of Judeo-Bolshevism, but I think that the pogroms of the Civil War play a crucial role and are a big piece of this puzzle. And what is so interesting that I was struck by the fact that in the context of the pogroms, really regardless of the actual choice that Jews make in the imagination of so many Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews become, the vector for spreading communism. And this builds on the growing perception of Jews as a compromised political actor, which is not unique to Jews. It applies to any minority group, right? Whenever there is, in the context of war, in the context of crisis, the state and the majority group always questions the allegiance and the political trustworthiness of minority groups. So that's crucial to keep in mind. Of course, you have systematic propaganda that is being employed both by the German army, the Polish army, but especially by the whites, but also Ukrainians are using it, in which, Jews are being equated to Bolsheviks. And what is interesting is that, this is a way to discredit Lenin, to discredit the Red Army. Of course, again, this is building on the fact that Trotsky is the leader of the Red Army, but it's a way to discredit this, this movement. And of course, it builds also, it doesn't start all of a sudden in 1917, 1918, 1905 is crucial, but the early 1900s are crucial when you have this mythic image of the Jewish revolutionary that is set to destroy Russia, that again goes back to the 1900s and becomes so popular in the right-wing, right-wing political circles and parties. Of course, the fact that Lenin condemns anti-Semitism, eventually condemns pogroms. I've studied carefully what happens in the 1920s and 1930s and how, there are so many complaints coming from below, from, the peasantry, from in different areas, especially in Ukraine. They're complaining, what is happening? Why can't we just carry out a pogrom, right? So that further fosters this identification of Jews with Bolshevism. It makes it acceptable. It makes it almost rational because look at what is happening. Pogroms are no longer possible. Anti-Semitism is, banned. As ambivalent as the Soviet state was vis-a-vis anti-Semitism, it was banned. So let me stop there.
Yeah, no, and some of that dynamic is also true then later on in post World War II Poland, and in the same way, and becomes this perilous combination of historical reality and the anti-Semitic ideas. I want to ask one more question, and then I just want to, and there are a number of questions. We will not get to all of them. Mark Slobin notes that his grandmother remembered the pogroms, and which claimed that his grandfather. And next week, Mark will be part of our panel on the Song Searcher, a film about Ukraine and the Yiddish culture and songs in Ukraine. But I want to bring us now. Obviously, when we planned this event, we didn't know how your books will have resonance in different ways. And I wonder whether you could reflect on their meaning, or the way, or perhaps the way your research gives meaning to what we're witnessing from afar, admittedly, about the current war on Ukraine. And again, as I was reading them, especially the last books in this context, there's certainly one could see many of the points of relevance. I wonder whether you want to comment on bringing it to today. And
Who should go?
Jaclyn, do you want to talk maybe about?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I know.
You started.
I really appreciate both Jeff and Elissa's work for examining the region that's now in war. And thinking about the long resonances of violence there. And when I read their books, I wonder at how exactly Ukraine so transformed its relationship to its Jews in the last few decades, which to me seems to be defying some serious historical odds. But I'm not like an expert in that. So I want to hear more from them about that. But what I've been thinking about ceaselessly is that here in the West, we've basically been hearing two different narratives. One is about on the ground reporting of war in Ukraine. And the second is kind of a discussion of what the West should do about what's happening in Ukraine, looping through this kind of cycle of nuclear deterrence, military aid, economic sanctions, then back to nuclear deterrence, military aid, and economic sanctions. But what my work does 100 years ago, of course, is to examine the humanitarian response outside of the war zones. And in the case of this crisis, my work is examining response to violence in this very region. And in that sense, remarkably little has changed. People in Western democratic countries, now as then, feel compelled to act. And they tend to do this by contributing to humanitarian causes. And then these humanitarian organizations and this outpouring of support prompts some kind of state action and actually does the work of saving and supporting some number of lives in the war zones. And so I see my work as showing a kind of historical way that that civilians in the West can and should navigate this war, including through empowering diaspora organizations and pushing their states to do humanitarianism, to think of humanitarianism as really a fundamental part of how you do war. But I have been feeling frustrated. Now, again, as then, humanitarian is what's actually the default Western civilian activities, the way most of us regular people are responding to war, but still not understood as this kind of main pillar of modern warfare. So, if anyone here wants to give me a platform to talk more about that, I will.
To me, I'll just say that, the transformation is not quite as radical as we think. That, my book argues that, I think shows that there were tremendous atrocities that were committed in Ukraine, and many of those atrocities were committed by people who identified as Ukrainian. But I think by explaining those atrocities, explaining why they took place, it doesn't say that there's anything innate to Ukrainians that makes them more violent. I utterly reject the notion that, Ukrainians were brought up with anti-Semitism in their blood or whatever one wants to say of that nature. I think the book shows it. The same thing for Poles, the same thing for Germans for that matter. In fact, anti-Semitism is embedded within Europe, within the Western tradition in serious ways. That are not by any means unique to Ukraine. There were a lot of Jews who supported the Ukrainian independence movement in 1918, 1919, and there were a lot of Jews who were even in the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government in 1918 offered the Jews a Ministry of Jewish Affairs and had a Secretariat of National Affairs and used Yiddish as one of their official languages. So there's also a strong tradition of multiculturalism in Ukraine. And I would argue, the Ukrainian diaspora has often been more anti-Semitic than those in Ukraine, but also it's the Ukrainian diaspora that even initiated the entire concept and the language of multiculturalism, which actually emerged in Canada in the 1970s by Ukrainian activists who were then the third largest ethnic group in Ukraine. And we're saying, we shouldn't think of Canada as just the French and English. We should think of it as multicultural. And they were borrowing. It was Ukraine historians of Ukraine living in Ukraine, including senators. Paul Yuzek, who was a senator, who was the first to use the word multiculturalism in the Canadian Parliament, which is the first time the term was used in a public venue of any kind. So Ukraine also has a strong tradition of multiculturalism. So for that reason, it does not surprise me. But there has been a real transformation, and it's because they've had essentially three revolutions. The first one in 1991, and then the other two subsequently, the Orange Revolution and then the Maidan Revolution. So, three revolutions to orient them towards the Western tradition, their idea of Europe as an open, democratic, pluralistic place. I think that idea is very strong in Ukraine. And I noticed it in the 10 years, now I guess 20 years that I've been going there, a huge transformation where at this point, at a certain point in time, it seemed that every single store that was opening up was the Euro deli, the Euro grocer, the Euro this, Euro that. Every store had the word Euro in front of it. And I think that just signifies the aspirations of, this still young country in really aspiring to be part of a pluralistic democratic entity instead of the autocratic backwardness of Russia.
Okay, so first let me just share how it has been, because I've been to Ukraine many times and many friends and their scholars and non-scholars. It has been quite, I would say, emotionally difficult to read about the events taking place, the systematic violence, indiscriminate violence against civilians in the same cities and towns where I have spent time, especially these reports that we are now getting a sense of how systematic rape is in the context of the war. It has been, the Russian troops are using it as an instrument of war to terrorize the civilian population in a very systematic and coordinated way. So that's one point that I wanted to mention. The other point that I wanted to mention is, I've been reading with my students the work just very recently of the great British historian Edward Carr, who really reminds us that to study history means to study the historian. And to understand the historian, we need to understand the time in which she is living. And I've been thinking about this and how I would have written differently about this violence had I been writing about it in the context of this horrific war that Russia has launched against Ukraine. And I think, and I'm thinking a lot about this question of coexistence and about the question that, as Jewish historians, we tend a lot to focus on anti-Jewish violence, which doesn't mean that it wasn't there. It was there, but sometimes we forget the coexistence that was an aspect of everyday life, even during war and violence. And I'm thinking about the witness accounts that I'm using that I've used, and I'm still writing about these pogroms, so that I'm using now, and about the fact that even these accounts focus, understandably so, on the violence of the neighbors, and don't really tell us much about those neighbors who rescued them. For example, one of the most important voices that I use for my book, this Yiddish writer Rachel Feigenberg, who dwells at length on the extreme violence, but doesn't tell us about the neighbors who rescued her and her newborn son, and the relationship between the neighbors. So I'm thinking about how coexistence, and how you study coexistence in the context of violence. Just to add to what Jeff said, and I agree with him. I agree with him entirely. I would just add that that if you think about the question of anti-Semitism today, in there's the Pew Research Center that put together the statistics of anti-Semitism, how much, they don't phrase it as anti-Semitism, but negative opinions vis-a-vis the Jews. And Ukraine has an 11%. It's the lowest percentage in Eastern Europe. Lithuania, Poland is much higher. Russia is 19%. And of course, these studies are not 100% correct. But I am very, very skeptical about any reference to this narrative of, you know, Russia presenting itself as the world redeemer of fascism, and really of turning to Ukraine as this, you know, as this epicenter of fascism in Eastern Europe. You know, less than 2% of the alt-right managed to be elected at the parliament in 2019, which is extraordinary compared to other countries in Eastern Europe. So, of course, the violence was there, the violence happened, but, you know, again, history is not destiny, and we see it in, you know, specifically in the context of Germany.
Yeah, we may feel trapped in history when we witness it, but we don't have to be trapped in history in that way. So I am afraid we can't get into any more of the questions, but I will forward them to our speakers. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I want to thank Jeff, Jaclyn, and Elissa for your generosity and time. And I urge everybody to read their books, which are just behind me. So thank you all, and we'll join us next week on April 26th for the conversation about the film Song Searcher. So thank you all, and if you want to have any closing final remarks, there's your chance before we end.
Thanks, Magda.
Thank you, Magda.
Thanks, Jaclyn.
That's the closing remark.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.